history and human civilization. But I figured, as kind of a compliment to Karl Marx, I would make a video about what Karl Marx got wrong. And I say that's a compliment because Karl Marx was not religion. He didn't write it in its only truth because he said it. Karl Marx was all about polemics in a lot of his writing, but he's constantly arguing with people, different socialists, different analysts of history, different philosophers. He's constantly arguing with people. He had no problem with back and forth debate on polemics. And if Karl Marx were alive today, he would want people to be engaging with his writings, not holding them up and just voting them in on people, but engaging with them and seeing how they hold up against the real world. He argued that his form of socialism was what he called scientific socialism. It wasn't religious or utopian socialism. And so if Karl Marx were alive today, he would want people to be engaging with him, saying what he got right, what he got wrong. So in that
There we go.
All right, our final speaker is going to be another Red Youth comrade of ours who helped us set up the group, and his name is Alex. So here's Alex. He's going to be speaking on the Chinese Revolution and Mao Zedong.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for previous speakers to have done such a tremendous job thus far. So I'm talking about China and the Chinese Revolution and the experience led by Mao Zedong. And first, to talk about achievements, we need to talk about the conditions that existed prior to these achievements to really take place. So prior to 1949, the Chinese Communist Revolution really solidified itself. China was a semi-feudal society. What does that mean? Up to about the 19th century, about the time of the Opium War in 1840, China was more or less feudal. They had feudal class relations with a landlord class, a monarch-like class, and a peasantry that served them, who created all the wealth. But this shift after the Opium War, the economy of China began to shift toward capitalism. Due to mostly imperialist inflow of capital, as Michael had spoken about earlier. Nations like Japan, England, and France were beginning to have a need to export capital to other nations in order to maintain their profits, and China was one of those places that they were doing this. And so how are they doing this? They were collaborating with the feudal class that existed within China during this time period, and basically trying to develop commodity production while at the same time keeping the ruling class happy. So this put China in this semi-feudal, semi-colonial state where the value of the workers' labor in Chinese society was in one part being exported to the imperialist centers, and in the other part being imperialist nations were fighting amongst each other, mostly some parts in the Middle East. What emerged in China was the disintegration of the Chinese emperor and warlord factions who were struggling to maintain control over the developing industrialization that was going on in China. So there were two factions that emerged to resist this, and they were the first, the nationalist Kuomintang, or the KMT, and of course the Communist Party of China, which at this point was not led by Mao Zedong, but he was a member of the party along with a number of others who were prominent within the Chinese Communist Party after the revolution. So during the struggle, the two maintained an alliance to fight against the warlord faction, and after that issue was resolved more or less and China was unified, the two entered in civil war with one another. as the Chinese had, the Communist Party had been building up a mass base, and the KMT was trying to, maintain control over just the capitalist economy, and they were opposed to the measures that the Communist Party was doing, arming the peasantry and trying to organize them to fight for their own good. After the Civil War began, they fought for about a decade, and then the Japanese during World War II began to invade China. So the two once again at least had a ceasefire and jointly opposed the Japanese. But meanwhile, while the KMT was not fighting the Communist Party was able to build up a mass base of support amongst the peasantry themselves. And so by the end of World War II, the Chinese Communist Party had about 1.2 million actually armed troops and another 2 million armed peasant militia groups, with which that they used to defeat the KMT in 1949 when they retreated to Taiwan. So that was the events leading up to the Industrial Revolution. So what happened after that? One of the first things that the Communist Party had was a land reform. And this was one of the major issues that the peasants themselves had problems with, because the land was very patriarchal, they were very chauvinist, and they treated the peasantry very poorly. And so there was a lot of gripe that the people had with the landlords. And so using members of the Communist Party to go out into the different areas within China and organize peasant associations, they collectively they confiscated the land from the landlords and then redistributed it. So the peasant families saw a definite increase in agricultural production. Furthermore, after the Chinese Revolution was successful, the life expectancy and infant mortality increased substantially. And now moving much further ahead, between the time period of 1949 to 1975, the life expectancy of a Chinese citizen
And then Olympia asks a very good question. How did Lenin improve on Marx? How did Mao improve on Lenin? Lenin understood that capitalism had developed into a monopoly stage of imperialism. Marx thought the revolution would come from the West, but Lenin understood what was happening in the economy in the 1890s, 1880s, and he understood that capitalism was developing into imperialism. And Lenin understood and analyzed how the social democratic movement, the Second International, the Marxist parties, the Goethe Program, the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, how the socialist movement of Marx was degenerating into not a revolutionary movement of the workers, but instead a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. Becoming a tool for stabilizing. Lenin understood that capitalism was expanding a global monopoly system. Lenin understood that the struggle with oppressive and colonized nations that would be the basis of revolution. The revolution wind would be blowing from the east and not the west. That was Lenin. That was Lenin's great breakthrough. And Lenin said you have to support nationalism. You have to support the people, peoples of oppressed nations that are fighting for independence. We have to oppose Western capitalism and imperialism. We have to break with social democracy and the Second International, because those parties, as much as they don't admit it, as they sound like Marxists, their movement is basically just becoming a mechanism for stabilizing Western capitalism. Lenin said that if you live in an imperialist country,
It is your all-out duty to oppose imperialist wars, right? And to turn imperialist wars around the world into civil wars at home. That's what Lenin said. Turn imperialist war into civil war. Soldiers, turn your guns around. The real enemy is at home. That's Marx. I mean, that's Lenin. That's all the brilliance of Lenin. Lenin took the crisis of Marxism breaking out across Europe, where the Marxist movement had deteriorated into this lame, reformist movement that was just about stabilizing Western capitalism, that supported World War I and sent 20 million workers off to their deaths. Lenin said, this movement is a stinking corpse. Marxism has turned into its opposite. But the historical and objective laws of history that Karl Marx understood and lay the basis for a revolutionary movement of colonized people in Africa, Asia, South America, Central America. It can be the basis for breaking them free. That's what Lenin discovered. And it's really important. Marxism without Lenin in our time is pretty outdated. You're still waiting for the factory workers in Germany to rise up and seize their factories. They're way behind, right? Imperialism and the split in socialism. Don't read Lenin's very little essay. Imperialism and the split in socialism. Lenin rescued Marxism from the social democracy. Marx's ideas were watered down into a mechanism for stabilizing Western capitalism. The Western capitalist countries were developing an aristocracy of labor, enabling them to go out and colonize the world, right? And Lenin said, nope. The fight against capitalism is the fight against imperialism. That will be the basis of revolutionary energy. That's Lenin. And Lenin realized that Russia, even though it was like part of the imperialist empire, that Russia was not a Western country. And he developed a method of organizing the Russian people against capitalism. It was called the Party of New Type, Bolshevism, democratic centralism, agitation, and propaganda. These are all unique concepts developed by Lenin that were completely different than how the European Marxist parties are. Lenin set up a new political party. The Bolsheviks were unlike. They were a new form of party that was uniquely Russian. The Russian condition. Russia had a long history of secret societies. A history of forming these secret societies, taking oaths to give the whole of your life in a revolution. It was all illiteracy. Peasantry couldn't read and write. A lot of the factory workers couldn't read and write. So, forming among the revolutionary intellectuals a party of new type, people who give the whole of their lives and they agitate the broad masses and they propagate to the advance. They find the advance and they propagate. And they agitate the advance, and they propagate, agitate the broad masses with greater confrontation, and they propagate These are all unique methods, and democratic centralism. You keep your disagreements internal. You have one newspaper that speaks of the party, right? And you keep your fights internal. And when you make a decision, everyone carries it out, whether they agree or not. They carry it out, right? This is all Lenin. This is Lenin. Now improve on Lenin. Well, now realize that the Chinese Revolution and the overwhelming majority of the population were peasants, and Mao grew up in the countryside. And there's been a huge civil war called the Taiping Uprising, in which some peasants, had discovered and met Christian missionaries and learned about Jesus. and declared he was Jesus' younger brother, sent to lead to create God's kingdom. And 30 years before Mao's China, the goal of creating God's kingdom on earth. And Mao knew about it and studied it. He said, wow, Mao, his father was a wealthy peasant. Mao grew up in Hunan in a peasant area. Mao saw that the peasants were very oppressed and that there was a basis for peasants to rise up. And then Mao, he moved to the cities. He studied at a university. He joined, he formed a group of young Chinese nationalist anarchists. It's called the New People's Study Society, the New People's Study Group. And they went around boycotting Japanese goods, and they were Chinese nationalists, essentially. They were inspired by Bakunin, and they were studied by Kropotkin, because Kropotkin was the Russian revolutionary organizing peasantry. Mao knew that it would be the peasants that would make the revolution in China. And when the Chinese Communist Party was formed, they formed a united front with the KMT. They organized in the cities, and then the KMT nationalists betrayed the united front, and they forced the communists, they exterminated the Communist Party. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched white terror, killing the communists. Right before the white terror started, Mao wrote an amazing essay that we included in the CPI, called Report on an Investigation in the Hunan Province. In that essay, Mao is saying it's going to be the peasantry who lead the revolution. It's going to be the peasantry. It's not going to be the factory workers. It's not going to be the urban. It's not even the peasantry. The proletariat. Only the industrial workers. And Mao said the peasantry are going to be the revolution. We can lead the peasantry. And we can lead them with proletarian ideology. It's very important. He said that you can have a peasant revolution led by proletarian ideology. And he broke out of the dogmatism that the Marxists said only factory workers could make a revolution. And he said, no. Stalin said that it would be on the basis of Chinese nationalism the revolution would happen. Trotsky said only the factory workers could be revolutionary. But Mao said, no. The peasantry will be the power. And the peasantry will be the key class of the revolution. But the factory workers will be part of it. But the national capitalists will be part of it too, and the middle-income peasants will be part of it. And the Communist Party, with its proletarian, scientific Marxist ideology, will sit at the center of a movement to emancipate the entire country. And that was Mao's breakthrough, that is the four classes, of which the peasantry is the overwhelming majority, led by the Communist Party with its proletarian ideology, to carry out the revolution. Right? That was a huge breakthrough on Mao's part. In addition to that, Mao developed methods for organizing in China that were unique to China's conditions. People always ask, why is Mao always talking about the 4 great thises and the 5 great that's, the 10 great relationships, the 4 olds and the 4 news, right? Why are the 4 olds? Why is Mao talking that? That's Confucianism. That's China's Confucian tradition. You memorize 4 great olds, right? The 10 great relationships. This is very unique to Chinese. When you're organizing in a society where you have mass illiteracy among the peasantry, if someone can't read or write, they can memorize the 10 great relationships. Right? This is all unique to Chinese. On top of that, Mao understood that one of the big issues in China was the Confucian family structure, and that there was a great amount of rage on the part of young people in China against the Confucian family structure. That was something that many young Chinese people were very infuriated by, or had a lot of anger about. And Mao tapped into the anger of young people. Right? Mao was a high school principal. The first essay that Mao ever published was about the need for physical education. Exercise. Right? And that Mao had a way of tapping into the anger of young Chinese adolescents at the very traditional, feudal, patriarchal family structure. Mao also had a particular interest in women, right? And that's one thing. Going back to even before Mao was a communist, Mao was organizing a study group. Young women refused to get into marriages, refused to accept arranged marriages, and wanted to join Mao. Thank you, Richard. I'm back. You know, Mao had one of his early essays was about a famous young Chinese woman who committed suicide. He talked about the oppression of women, the fury of women and their oppression, the anger of women and their degradation was going to be a key part of the revolution. And, you know, from the beginning, they had women's divisions of the military. You know, one of the most famous operas in China during the Cultural Revolution was called The Red Detachment of Women. There was another opera that was very famous called The White-Haired Girl, right? It was about a girl with white hair, a revolutionary hero. All of this, the white-haired girl, the red detachment of women, now had an understanding of where the energy was. He did what a communist is supposed to do. A communist is supposed to go into society and say, where are the contradictions? Where is the energy?
Эй, ты, выходи по-доброму, а то
How
я
can
здесь, и
I
лучше не вырывайся.
within that energy
Выходи сам,
to
с
push
поднятыми
forward
руками.
the revolution drop down from the sky?
Бросай оружие и выходи.
Was
По-хорошему.
already there. The anger of the women that was already there.
Эй, ты, выходи по-доброму, а то я тебя заберешь.
Now broke with the dogmatism of the Western Marxists and of the Communist International that said, oh, it's nation, nationalism. Well, that was a big part of it. Trotskyites said the factory workers. Mao said no. He understood China way more than the communists. He understood China way more than the dogmatic Marxists were. He understood where the energy was in his society. And he said, you know what? If we're going to win this thing, we got to go where the energy is. The energy is with the peasantry. And it was on the basis of the peasantry and the youth and the women that Mao led the Chinese Revolution. And he led the youth and the women with a proletarian ideology, society Marxism. But he wasn't dogmatic in trying to make it happen and push it happen. Mao's brilliance is really responsible for the fact that if you go in the United States right now, where's the energy? Where's the energy in opposition to the FBI company? Where does the energy in opposition to wars and imperialism? Where is the energy in opposition to big banks and corporations coming from? Where is the energy in opposition to Silicon Valley and the tech censorship coming from? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from the wokes? No. Is it coming from the socialist groups? No. The energy of resistance in the United States right now is coming from the MAGA. Now that doesn't mean we should agree with them, but that means that if we're serious Marxists, that's what we have to learn to engage with.
Oh, fuck!
I can tell the Chinese communist in his essay said it's going to be the peasant. It's going to be the peasant. Go read the report on the nonprofit and say, look, the anger, the resistance is coming from the peasant. That's what it's coming from. Even though we're a rich city, even though when they revolt, they do crazy things like cut people's heads off. That's what we got to relate. We got to relate. Now we can see that's where the energy is. And if you're in America in 2022, you got to realize that the energy is coming from the MAGA. Those people stormed the Capitol, for Christ's sake. Look at what Kerry Lake is doing. Listen to Tulsi Gabbard. They're wrong. They love capitalism. They hate China. They answered everything. They're wrong. The left is completely co-opted. The energy is coming from the MAGA. And so if you're serious, win MAGA people have to pander to them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with reactionary things that they say. But that's who we should be trying to appeal to, not the wokes, right? This is Mao's brilliance, right? You go where the energy is, right? And that's what I'll say about that. Maoism is in China. It's the peasantry in America. There ain't no peasantry here, right? We don't have filial piety. We don't have the traditional patriarchal family structure like they had in China. You know? I mean, we don't have foot binding here. We don't have arranged marriages here. So, Mao's on the front is very much socialism with Chinese. It's a different concept of Xiaoping developed. The method that Mao used, identifying where the energy is, that's something. But the actual thing, like we're going to organize the peasantry of America, no. There's no peasantry here. So, that's what we can take from Mao.
Я тебя уделаю, слышишь?
Innovation in Marxism. The journey.
Can you guys actually hear what I'm playing? Hold on a second. Oh man, I'm very hot. I'm just very hot. Very hot. There's no way for me to rewind on this. Come on.
There's no.
Okay, Marxism to innovationism.
Innovation in Marxism. All right. We're going to first talk about the word
I will be right back.
A lot of people think the word socialism.
I will be right back. I gotta make coffee. All right.
Innovation and Marxism, the journey. All right, we're going to first talk about the word socialism. A lot of people think the word socialism and the word Marxism and the word communism are all synonymous. That is not the truth. The word socialism goes back pretty far. It goes back to the early 1800s. And it goes back to France in 1789. And the French Revolution. They declared rights, liberté, égalité, fraternity, freedom, egalitarianism, and brotherhood. Right? Those were the slogans of the French Revolution. And they said that on the back of feudalism in France, they were going to create a fair and just society. And they were going to do it in the name of individual rights and the rights of man. But they didn't get it. And after the French Revolution, after the king had had his head chopped off, and a lot of the injustice that existed, it seemed like people almost had no obligation to each other. The rallying cry of the French Revolution had largely been a fight for individual rights and individualism. And so after the French Revolution, there was a philosopher. He started contrasting the liberalism and individualism of the New World that came out of the French Revolution with his understanding of something opposing that, and he called it socialism. Henry Saint-Simon, looks like Simon, had no obligation to each other. The rallying cry of the French Revolution had largely been a fight for individual rights and individualism. And so after the French Revolution, there was a philosopher, a guy named Henry Saint-Simon. Looks like Simon, but it's French, so it's pronounced Simon. Henry Saint-Simon. And he started contrasting the liberalism and individualism of the New World that came out of the French Revolution with his understanding of something socialism. And we're a social society. Individualism, liberalism, we need to have to protect poor people. And in French, you have this thing called socialism. It was a critique of the first person to use socialism in English was a guy named Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was a wealthy man from Wales. He owned a bunch of factories. But he saw that the workers in his factories were treated very, very badly. And so he set up a model community in Scotland, New Lanark. He set up this model community where all the people were equal and held the wealth in common. And eventually they packed up and they moved to Japan. And Robert Owen, he was a critic of mainstream religion, also of spiritualism. He thought he could help people, seances of people, and, he was an advocate for Africa. Into the U.S. Congress. And that was socialism. And at the time, coming out of the French Revolution, all across the Western countries, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, places like that, in in the big cities, you had what you called the revolutionary intelligentsia. And this had come out of, in the lead up to the French Revolution, people had gathered to discuss ideas. And they gathered in these places they called salons, which were places where people would gather and debate. And as a result of the salons, in most big cities, London, and Rome, and Venice, and New York City, and places like that, you had a group of people that were sitting around talking about ideas, basically. They were just debating ideas. And a lot of these people were what they call idlers. Idlers. Now, those are individuals of significant wealth who do not have to work. And it was a big phenomenon. People whose parents were wealthy capitalists. And so they sat around in wealthy they would hire spiritualists to help them talk to the dead. And they would, they were very interested in going to operas. And they attended operas. And among the idlers, there was a minority of idlers, of very wealthy people who had a lot of time to just sit around and, be entertained. They didn't have to work. Among the idlers, there was a small minority who were very interested in social justice. There was one wealthy idler named Frederick Engels. And Frederick Engels' father was a wealthy factory owner. And Frederick Engels was a rich kid, the child of multimillionaires, and he didn't have to work. And he was young, and he was interested in social justice. He was interested in socialism. And there were a lot of different people running around talking to the idlers and entertaining the rich people and the revolutionary ideas about socialism. And they all had different ideas. They were all arguing about which type of socialism was the best. Well, Frederick Engels was one of these rich people, and he listened to different intellectuals, different writers about socialism, and he ran into Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was one wealthy intellectual socialist. He was hanging around these circles. He was in Germany at first, and then he moved to Paris, and he was in London for a while. And Karl Marx was just a guy who wrote pamphlets and books about socialism and was very interested in socialism, etc. And Frederick Engels, the young wealthy idler Frederick Engels, met Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, at the time, was trying to show poverty, and coined the phrase, poverty is theft. So Karl Marx lampooned his type of socialism. He said it's wrong, and so he wrote The Poverty of Philosophy and debunked it. And there's a whole lot of that. And that Karl Marx was going around these intellectual circles arguing about philosophy, arguing about revolution and socialism. And Engels became convinced that Karl Marx's brand of socialism was the best. And they called it scientific socialism. Now, why did they call it scientific socialism? Because to be scientific at this time meant you were modern and new, right? They were coming out of feudalism. It was the age of reason. The Catholic Church was viewed as this oppressive institution that was, holding back revolution. The age of reason, the age of really good. And based his understanding of what socialism was on dialectical and historical materialism. First of all, he argued that the nature of reality was that all that existed was matter. He rejected any spirituality. There is no God, there is no spirituality, there's no power of thought, it's all just matter. But that matter is constantly contrasting itself, clashing, right? In ancient philosophy, going back to ancient Greece, debate, is the brain reacting to material created by the brain, right? Materialism says the mind is a physical thing that just reflects the reality that's already there. And Marx was a materialist. He said the only reason you think is because you have a piece of matter in your brain, that is called a brain that does thinking. Thought is philosophy. Going back to ancient Greece, there was a debate. Is the brain reacting to material, or is material created by the brain? Right? And that's materialism versus idealism. Idealism says the mind creates reality. Materialism says the mind is a physical thing that just reflects the reality that's already there. And Marx was a materialist. He said the only reason you think is because you have a piece of matter in your brain, that is called a brain that does thinking. Thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, and that thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that is a reflection of hard material reality, right? But he argues that material is constantly in a state of contradiction. It's constantly clashing. And that it's through the clash and the conflict that history advances. And dialectical materialism is understanding that all that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion and constantly clashing against itself. That leads to the notion of historical materialism, which is that human civilization is constantly advancing to a higher stage. Human beings are moving toward a higher mode of production. Just as hunter-gatherer civilization was eventually replaced by slavery, and slavery was replaced by feudalism. Feudalism was replaced by capitalism. Eventually, out of that will come socialism. And the main thing separate from all the others. Materialism and all of this is scientific socialism. What was the conclusion that Marx came to that set him apart from all the other socialists going around? From Proudhon, from Auguste Bebel, from all these people going around talking about different ideas about what socialism is. Robert Owen, Henry Saint-Simon, Franz Fourier. What made Marx different? Marx said socialism will come out of the labor movement. That was the defining characteristic of Marxism. All these other people said socialism will be created by it being a good idea. We're just going to see that it's better and they'll adopt it. But everybody else basically said socialism is going to be just something that comes out of our head. Right? It's going to be a battle of ideas. Whereas Karl Marx, with his scientific socialism, he's saying it's actually the struggle between the factory worker and the factory owner. That is what is going to lead to socialism. That the factory worker is not paid the full value of what he produces. The capitalist system has built-in economic problems. There's more goods created than purchasing power paid out in wages, and the worker can never buy back what he produces. And then eventually, the labor movement is advancing to a higher stage. Human beings are moving toward a higher mode of production. Just as, hunter-gatherer civilization was mentioned. And that thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that is a reflection of hard material reality, right? But he argues that material is constantly in a state of contradiction. It's constantly clashing. And that it's through the clash and the conflict that history advances. And dialectical materialism is understanding all that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion and constantly clashing against itself. That leads to the notion of historical materialism, which is that human civilization is constantly advancing to a higher stage. Human beings are moving to a higher mode of production. Just as hunter-gatherer civilization was eventually slavery and feudalism. Feudalism was replaced by capitalism. Eventually, out of that will come socialism. And the main thing, and this is the important thing, advancing to a higher stage. Human beings are moving toward a higher mode of production. And just as hunter-gatherer civilization was replaced by slavery, and slavery was replaced by feudalism. Feudalism was replaced by capitalism. Eventually, out of that will come socialism. And the main thing, and this is what set Karl Marx separate from all the other socialists. What was it Karl Marx with his complex ideas of dialectical scientific, what was the conclusion that Marx came to that set him apart from all the other socialists going around? From Proudhon, from Auguste Bebel, from all these people going around talking about different ideas about what socialism is. Robert Nolan, Henry Saint-Simon, Franz Fourier. What made Marx different? Marx said, socialism will come out of the labor. That was the defining characteristic of Marxism. All these other people said socialism would be created by it being a good idea. We're just going to go around telling people that socialism is better, and they're going to see that it's better, and they'll adopt it. Maybe we'll take control of the government, and we'll use the government to create socialism. Maybe we'll build a model community. But everybody else basically said socialism is going to be just something that comes out of our head, right? It's going to be a battle of ideas. Whereas Karl Marx, with his scientific socialism, he's saying it's actually the struggle between the factory worker and the factory owner. That is what is going to lead to socialism. That the factory worker is not paid the full value of what he produces. The capitalist system has built-in economic problems. There's more goods created than
Турила,
produced.
ты лучше не наливайся, я уже не ушел. Выходи сам, с поднятыми руками. Да никуда он не денется.
That is what separated Karl Marx from all the other socialists. All the other socialists believed that socialism would come through the power of ideas. Karl Marx believed socialism would come through the labor movement. And basically what happened is that, Frederick Engels started paying for Karl Marx's work, and Karl Marx was going around trying to recruit all the rich people and all the people that were interested in socialism to go build labor unions, eventually having working class political party that would represent
Yes!
dictatorship of the proletariat. And that was the defining aspect of Marx, is that Marx believed social.
All right, we're at the dictatorship of the proletariat, comrades. I'll be right back. Just listening through this shit.
And basically what happened is that, Frederick Engels started...
There we go, yes.
All the people that were interested in socialism to go
awesome.
labor unions.
Yes.
Labor unions and eventually
yes.
have a working class political party that would represent the working class in the government. I'm just going to go around.
All right. Awesome. Save. There we go. All right, it's been done. Now it'll be so much easier to do this. Sorry about that, y'all, but although I lost a lot of health, at least I got most of them out. Might have to throw a grenade at them.
Турила, ты лучше не нарывайся. Выходи сам с поднятыми руками. Эй, ты, выходи по-доброму, а то костей не соберешь.
Where is the menu?
Ну все, сталкер, хана тебе! Пристрелю тебя, гад, как собаку пристрелю! Черт! Он, может, уйти успел, пока мы телились. Ты у меня с дыркой в голове валяться будешь.
Okay, that takes care of the radiation corruption.
Бросай оружие и выходи! По-хорошему! Пристрелю тебя, гад, как собаку пристрелю!
Around telling people that socialism is better, and they're going to see that it's better, and they'll adopt it. Maybe we'll take control of the government, and use the government to create socialism. Maybe we'll build a model community. But everybody else basically said socialism is going to be just something that comes out of our head, right? It's going to be a battle of ideas. Whereas Karl Marx, with his scientific socialism, he's saying actually the struggle between the factory worker and the factory worker. That is what is going to lead to socialism. The factory worker is not paying for the capitalist system has built-in economic problems. There's more goods created than purchasing power paid out in wages, and the worker can never buy back what he produces, and that eventually the labor movement is going to lead to the worker class majority taking control of the government and creating socialism. that is what defined Marxism. That is what separated Karl Marx from all the other socialists. All the other socialists believed that socialism would come through the power of ideas. Karl Marx believed socialism would come through the labor movement. And basically what happened is that, Frederick Engels started paying for Karl Marx's work, and Karl Marx was going around trying to recruit all the rich people and all the people that were interested in socialism to go build labor unions and go organize labor unions and eventually have a working class political party that would represent the working class in the government, and that eventually the working class would seize control of the government. That's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that was the defining aspect of Marx, is that Marx believed socialism and communism would be achieved through the labor movement. And so all socialism is not Marxism. Many people were socialists long before Karl Marx was ever around. Karl Marx is the guy who said it would come through struggle, it would come through the labor movement. And when Marxism emerged, Marxism was the struggle to create a mass labor movement as a way to achieve socialism. That the labor unions, the Chartist movement, all these mass movements of workers demanding pay from their employers, that would be the basis of it. So Karl Marx, he created the First International, which was an attempt to get working class revolutionary activists from many different countries in Europe united into one single organization, the International Working Men's Association, the First International. And it was around for a little bit, 1864 to 1876, about 12 years. But there was a huge amount of infighting between different factions. Anarchists who just wanted the bloody revolution, the people that just wanted pure and simple trade unionism, didn't want to actually build a revolutionary movement. There's a whole lot of infighting, and eventually the First International fell apart. However, shortly after Karl Marx died, there was something called the Second International that was created in 1889, and it's still around today. It's called the Socialist International. And the movement that really came out of Karl Marx is called social democracy. Right? After Karl Marx died, 1889, you got the German Social Democratic Party, you had the British Labour Party, you had the Austrian Social Democratic Party, you had the Labour Party of Belgium, and you got the Labour Party of all these different places. You eventually had socialist and Labour and Social Democratic parties emerging all over Europe. And these were political parties that represented labor unions. That was basically what they were. They were political parties, and their job, their goal was to get elected to the government and eventually build a mass labor movement so the working class would take control of the government. That was the idea. They would have a labor movement, and the labor movement would become a political party, and the political party and the labor unions would eventually rise up and take control of the government. And that movement is called social democracy, and it still exists. And it's actually one of the biggest political movements in the Western world. Democratic Socialists of America is part of social democracy. They were members of the Socialist International for a long time. The British Labour Party, the German Social Democrats, the French Socialist Party, and, it's a widespread belief that we should have a political party that represents labor unions, that the government should pass laws that favor working people. That's what came out of Marxism, right? Again, a lot of people think the only thing that ever came out of Marxism was Lenin. That's not true. There's this whole other movement called social democracy. That was the first thing that came out of Marxism. But social democracy hit a brick wall, right? It hit a brick wall because there was the crisis of Marxism. In early 1900, socialism was everywhere. The social democratic parties, the labor parties were everywhere. The labor unions were growing in big numbers, but there wasn't any revolution. They didn't have any revolution. And in fact,
I don't know how to resist this.
Marx had predicted.
I don't know how to deal with this radiation poison.
Communism would be achieved through the labor movement of all these different places. You eventually had socialist and labor and social democratic parties emerging all over Europe. And these were political parties that represented labor unions. That was basically what they were. They were political parties, and their job, their goal was to get elected to the government and eventually build a mass labor movement so the working class would take control And the labor movement would form a political party, and the labor unions would eventually rise up and take control of the government. And that movement is called social democracy, and it still exists. And it's actually one of the biggest political movements in the Western world. Democratic Socialists of America is part of social democracy.
Этого
They're
еще не
members of the
хватало. Неужели ушли?
British Labour Party, the German Social Democrats, the French Socialist Party, and, you know, it's a widespread belief that we should have a political party that
Я
represents
тебя
labor
уделаю,
unions.
Пристрелю тебя, как собаку
Again,
пристрелю.
a lot of people think, well, the only thing that ever came out of Marxism was Lenin. That's not true. There's this whole
Ты
other
у меня
movement
с дыркой в
called
голове
social
валяться
democracy.
будешь.
That was the first thing that came out of Marxism. But social democracy hit, right? It hit a brick wall because there was the crisis of Marxism. In early 1900, socialism was everywhere. The social democratic parties, the labor parties were everywhere. The labor unions were growing in big numbers, but there wasn't any revolution. And they didn't have any revolution. And in fact, what Marx had predicted was not coming true. Marx had predicted that in Germany and France and Britain and America, the poor would just keep getting poorer, and it would result in a situation where the workers would have no choice but to overthrow capitalism and establish the government. But that didn't happen. And in fact, what was happening was that a lot of working people, not the majority, but a significant number of working people were having their income go up. And capitalism was becoming more stable, not less stable. It was becoming more economically stable. And as a result, you were not having a revolution. Communism, socialist movements, Marxist groups, labor unions, social democrats, they were everywhere. Millions of people were joining these groups. The German Social Democratic Party was the largest political party in the world.
Okay, I will be right back. I gotta go to the bathroom. Alright, I'm back. Forge Gang returns. I'm back. Again, I can't help that. Nothing I can do about it.
At this point, no other political party of any type was as big as the German Social Democrat Party, started by Friedrich Engels, was, but people weren't interested in having a revolution. So what's going on? What's the problem? And there were different attempts to explain what was happening. One of the biggest arguments was a guy named Edward Bernstein, and he said that, actually Marx had it wrong. It's not a revolution, it's just reform. That capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism one step at a time. And that because we have universal male suffrage, because every man can vote, that will lead to a situation where there's more workers than there are capitalists, output capitalism, socialism. And socialism is just the sum of reforms. It's like a brick wall, right? One day you have healthcare, one day you have labor unions, one day you have universal free education, and the next thing you know, it's socialism. But there's no revolution. It just kind of naturally emerges, right? That was Bernstein's argument, and that was called revisionism. And a lot of Marxists became revisionists because they said, look, we're not seeing the revolution, and we have universal male suffrage, and we have a 12-hour workday, we have all these things that sound awful to us now. So basically, the Western countries are just kind of naturally becoming socialist anyway. And there were some Marxists that went along with it, and that became a pretty widespread view. However, there was one guy who definitely didn't agree with that view, and that guy was Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was let's just talk about Vladimir Lenin for a second, right? Lenin is very famous, right? He's in Hollywood movies, and, you see images of him, there's paintings and all of that. Lenin was a very socially awkward person. He had a speech impediment, he had a lisp when he spoke, and he was obsessive. He was obsessive with politics. One of his critics said, "What are you going to do with a guy who talks, writes, thinks, and breathes nothing but revolution 24 hours a day?" That's how Lenin was. He was an obsessive, socially awkward person with a speech impediment, and he had fits of anxiety. He wouldn't sleep for days. He would get really upset. He would calm himself down by playing the piano and by playing chess. And he was quite emotionally wrapped up in what he did. And he was this guy who had joined the Marxist movement in Russia, and he was obsessed. He was obsessive. He was a socially awkward, obsessive individual, and he was obsessive. And he definitely did not believe in revisionism. He did not believe that capitalism in the West was just naturally. And Lenin was from a quite revolutionary family. His older brother had actually gotten the death penalty because he tried to kill the Tsar. His brother had become an anarchist, terrorist, and had tried to kill the Tsar and gotten the death penalty. And as of nervousness, huge amounts of anxiety, he wouldn't sleep for days. And when he would get really, really upset, he would calm himself down by playing the piano and by playing chess. And he was quite emotionally wrapped up in what he did. Who had joined the Marxist movement in Russia. And he was obsessed. He was a socially awkward, obsessive individual. And he was obsessive. And he definitely did not believe in revisionism. He did not believe that capitalism in the West was just naturally turning into socialism. And Lenin was from a quite revolutionary family. His older brother had actually gotten the death penalty because he tried to kill the Tsar. His brother had become an anarchist, terrorist, and had tried to kill the Tsar and gotten the death penalty. And as a result, Lenin's family had been social pariahs. They lived in a town where there was a university, and they were a well-known family. But when his older brother tried to kill the Tsar, people wouldn't speak to them. And so at a time when he was a teenager, basically, he was like socially shunned by all of society, and that's Lenin, right? And we have this image of Lenin as the great agitator, as the great organizer. That's not who Lenin was. Lenin was just a very, very obsessed, socially awkward, very, very anxious guy, really, really into Marxism. And Lenin said, no, capitalism isn't just naturally turning into socialism. No. No, he rejected Bernsteinism completely. In 1902, they decided that they needed a new type of revolutionary organization in Russia. They needed the Party of New Type. And so in London, a bunch of Russians who had, gotten arrested or been persecuted by the
Нету
Tsar
его!
moved to
Куда же он делать
London,
мог?
and they were living in London because that's where they were exiled. And they were living in London, and so Lenin got together all of the Russian Marxists living in London, and got them in a room, and he pitched them on his idea to form the Party of New Type. And his idea was that they were going to form an organization that was basically a secret society for people who would give the whole of their lives to revolution. And this organization would have one newspaper to represent its views, and this organization would require you to obey orders. If you didn't agree with what the party was doing, you either did what the party said or you left the organization. You didn't have the option of picking and choosing what you believed. They had one newspaper to speak for the whole organization. They didn't have a bunch of privately owned newspapers owned by different people. They had one voice for the organization. They would engage in agitation for the masses, to stir up the masses to rebel, and they would look among the masses, the best, the brightest, and they would propagate to them. It was quite a method that he pitched. He said, I'm going to form this new organization, and we're going to use all these methods, highly disciplined, all these people get the whole of their lives, and all of this. And the majority of the people in the room said, sign me up. And the minority of the people in the room said, no, I'm not going to do this. And so, from then on, Lenin's organization was called the Bolsheviks, and the other organization that didn't accept this, people didn't accept it among the Russian Marxists, they were called the Mensheviks. That's what they were known as, Bolsheviks. And now that gets interesting. That gets a little bit interesting. Because the majority of Marxists in Russia didn't agree with Lenin. It was just the majority of the people in the room. So this is where it gets confusing. The Bolsheviks were the majority of the people in the room, but among the Russian Marxists, they were the minority. And the Mensheviks, they were the minority of people in the room in London, but they were the majority among the Russian Marxists. So it's all backwards. But regardless, Lenin's group were called the Bolsheviks. And they had this whole new political organization here, this whole new organizational method called the Party of New Type. Now, the Party of New Type is kind of contradictory to what Marx believed. Marx was an advocate of total freedom of speech. Marx wanted to get rid of the death penalty. And Marx was all about open debate and passing resolutions and Robert's Rules of Order and all of that. And Lenin's Party of New Type, no, there's no debate. Once we resolve the question, once the debate is over, the matter is closed, and you carry it out or you get out of the group. And that people saw the Party of New Type that Lenin created as very non-Western and very Russian. In Russia, there's a whole history of secret societies, the Old Believers, right? When the Russian Orthodox Church changed its beliefs, there were a number of Russian Orthodox folks who held on to their beliefs. They were called the Old Believers. And the Old Believers, they had secret signs, secret codes. The men among the Old Believers, they refused to cut their beards. And so in Russia, in the 1800s, or when they were suppressing the Old Believers, there was a fine. If you had a beard, a long beard like Old Believers, then you had to pay a fine. There was a beard tax, and then you had to have a token. If you stop doing it and have your token, then they would arrest you. You had to pay your beard tax. It's like a penalty you had to pay for having a beard because the Russian Orthodox Church no longer promoted beards. And there were the Decembrists. This was another secret society that had, tried to overthrow one of the Tsar Nicholas I. They attempted a coup. And so in Russia, they had a whole history of secret societies, secret orders, traditional kind of things. And the Party of New Type was not Western. It was not liberal. It was not open. And after the Party of New Type, the Bolsheviks, Lenin came up with this new theory, and he explained how it was, why it was that what Marx predicted wasn't coming true. He said Marx had thought that capitalism in the Western countries would eventually lead to an economic crisis, and workers would rise up and overthrow their bosses and have a revolution. What Marx didn't understand is that capitalism has entered a new stage called imperialism, and that now the big corporations, big banks in Western countries are all over the world, and as a result, they've been able to buy off a big chunk of workers and homes. Western countries. It's going to be in the Eastern countries. That the fight is not against just regular capitalism, it's against imperialism, against these big monopolies that are dominating the world. And the countries around the world, colonized and oppressed countries, are going to have socialism to break out of imperialism. This is completely contrary to what Marx taught. Marx taught that socialism came from the labor movement, came from the workers fighting the bosses. Lenin says that because of imperialism, socialism is going to come from struggles of national liberation. It'll be oppressed nations fighting against imperialism that'll adopt socialism. This is a completely new theory, right? And Marx said that Germany would be the first communist country. The Communist Manifesto ends with "Now we turn to Germany." And Marx thought, the West was going to be communist first because it was the most advanced. But Lenin said, no. In the West, the imperialist monopolies have bought off a section of the class, and so the working class is divided, and so the revolutionary energy is going to be in the East. And Lenin goes as far as to say we must support nationalism. Nationalism of oppressed countries is good. Marx and others had said workers of the world unite. There are no nations. Now, Marx had eventually realized that the Irish national struggle is good. He'd also realized that the Polish national struggle is good. But for most of Marx's life, and most of the Marxist movement said nationalism, all nationalism is bad. But Lenin said nationalism is bad in Europe, right? It's bad for the Germans, it's bad for the British, it's bad for the Italians. But African nationalism, if they're fighting the imperialists, that's great. Indian nationalism, it's great. Asian nationalism in South America, that's good because it'll lead fights of national liberation that will have socialism because imperialism dominates the world. So Lenin basically gets this whole new organization. They're going to run their organization as a secret society that's really strict, and the way it's all set up, that's completely not the way Marx did things. On top of that, he's saying we're not fighting regular capitalism. It's not the workers versus the bosses. It's the colonized people of the world fighting for national liberation. And he changed everything. And, he drew heavily from Marx's understanding of economics, and he pulled from places where Marx said things that were similar to what he said. But Leninism, what Lenin did, and Bolshevism, was a whole new thing. And increasingly, the Bolsheviks, you have to remember, this is the most important thing. The Bolsheviks were viewed as a bunch of freaks by the global Marxist movement, right? The global communist movement thought the Bolsheviks were a bunch of weirdos, that they were a bunch of freaks, they were a bunch of weirdos. People frequently pointed out, they said the Bolsheviks, they said they're not a revolutionary party. They're a monastic religious order. They compared them to like the Franciscans, right, or the Jesuits or something. And they called them a cult, and they called them weird and authoritarian and Russian, and they have this whole new theory about imperialism, and if you join, you have to give the whole of your life, and everything about the Bolsheviks, they were completely different than European Marxism. There was a movement at the time called Marxism, and the Bolsheviks were this weird spin-off and deviation of Marxism, and that is a really important thing. And you won't know this by reading their writings. The Bolsheviks were constantly trying to say, no, we're the real Marxists. The other Marxists have sold out. If Marx was alive, he would be in our movement. We're the true Marxists. So if you read what they wrote, you don't get that understanding. Yeah, you would think that they're the real Marxists. But the global Marxist movement thought the Bolsheviks were weirdos. They thought they were deviants. They thought they were freaks. They thought their interpretation of Marxism was bizarre. They thought things that were completely at odds with what Marxists thought. Marxists thought you should have open, free, debating societies, political parties. Marxists thought the most advanced capitalist countries would be socialist first. Marxists thought nationalism was always bad. Workers of the world unite. Marxists thought, it's going to come as a fight between the factory worker and the factory owner. The Bolsheviks, what they believed was a freak interpretation of Marxism, right? They were, you can compare it to, right, Mormons. Mormons Christians. They consider themselves Christians, but they have a whole new Bible, right? The Book of Mormon. They have a whole new prophet, Joseph Smith. And so, yeah, they Jesus and all of that, but they took it in a completely different direction. The Bolsheviks were the Mormons of communism. And that's what you need to remember, right? Marxism was the foundation, but they had a whole new prophet, Lenin. They had a whole new interpretation. They were doing something very, very different on the foundation of Marxism. And that, you must remember. going to make sense. People say to me, well, Caleb, you know, did you know that the Labour Party in Britain is a socialist party? Yeah, I do know that, actually. They're part of the Second International, but they're not Leninists, right? And I said, Caleb, did you know that, you know, the DSA is this new socialist group? I said, yeah, you know, they are, but they're not Leninists. They're from the Second International. They're social democracy. What Marx created was watered down and became social democracy. And Lenin was this weird deviant within Marxism that came up with this whole new theory that laid the foundation for his own movement that was called Bolshevism. And the difference between Marxism as an established movement, the biggest Marxist party in the world was the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party. And the differences between Marxism and Bolshevism became most apparent when World War I took place. All these socialist parties of Europe had promised they would never support World War I. They would never support World War I, right? They would never support workers going to kill other workers. And then World War I came along, and they said, whoopsie daisy, and they forgot all about that, and they supported World War I. Okay? And if you go and read Lenin's writings from around 1916, 1914, 1915, he is filled with rage. And if you go and read his writings, Lenin points out that World War I would never have happened without the socialists, without the Marxist parties. They let it happen. They enabled it to happen. If the German Social Democratic Party had stood up against World War I, they could have stopped it. If the British Labour Party had stood up against World War I, they could have stopped it. If the socialist members of Congress in the United States had stood up against World War I and stood with Eugene Debs, they could have stopped it. That World War I, they needed the socialists to make it happen. The socialists recruited the labor unions and recruited the workers to go and fight. And that is an essential thing. And if you read Lenin, he makes this point. It's not simply a matter of the Marxists abandoned their principles. They were an essential part of imperialism. This economic system of imperialism needed socialists to be part of it, right? It needed corrupt union bosses. It needed socialist college professors. It needed people that could speak like working class revolutionaries to make it work. And World War I would never have happened without socialists. So the idea that Lenin is just another Marxist, no, the overwhelming majority of the Marxists supported World War I. And Lenin opposed World War I. And he fumed with rage at the Marxist movement for supporting World War I. And fumed with rage, how dare they? He called the Second International, he called it a stinking corpse. And he just, fumed with rage. And again, I told you that Lenin was, somebody who was very emotional, wouldn't sleep for days, had fits of anxiety, so you can imagine, if you go and read anything Lenin wrote, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, on the Collapse of the Second International, he is screaming with rage at the Marxist movement because they sold out. And actually, there's a quote from him that I frequently use. I think I can put it on the screen if I can find the image. There's a quote from one of his essays. It's one of my favorite quotes. I've used it many times before, because it is just so important. Right? Yeah, here we go. This is the quote that Lenin says. Neither we nor anyone else can calculate precisely what portion of the proletariat is following and will follow the social chauvinists and opportunists. This will be revealed only by the struggle, and it will be definitely decided only by the socialist revolution. But we know for certain that the defenders of the fatherland in imperialist war represent only a minority, and it is therefore our duty, if we wish to remain socialists, to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. This is the whole meaning and the whole purport of the struggle against opportunism. By exposing the social chauvinists and opportunists, who are in reality betraying and selling the interests of the masses, that they are defending the temporary privileges of a minority of workers, that they are vehicles of bourgeois ideas and influences, they're really allies and agents of the bourgeoisie. We teach the masses to appreciate their true political interests and to fight for socialism through all the long and painful vicissitudes of imperialist war and imperialist armistice. He's saying we don't even want to be part of this fake socialist movement. We want to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. He basically is saying we have nothing to do with this social democratic movement that is leading workers off to die. So, you know, there's two distinct movements. There's three distinct movements now. First, you have socialism, which is just this vague critique of Western liberal society. Out of socialism, you get Marxism, which is the belief that socialism, some kind of egalitarian society, can be created through the labor movement. And out of Marxism, you get yet another movement called Bolshevism. And Bolshevism is this weird interpretation of Marxism here of the party of new type, theory of imperialism, with the theory of supporting national liberation, revolutionary energy is to colonize the world from the east rather than the west. But Bolshevism is yet a third movement. Well, what happened is in 1917 there was some weird historical circumstance. One thing led to another, and as a result of the revolutionary crisis of World War I, as a result of Germans giving Lenin a huge amount of money and sending him back to Russia. Lenin was living in Switzerland, and the German intelligence, the German spies met with them and said, hey, you want to go back to Russia to stir up trouble? And they put him on a train and gave him a bunch of money and sent him back there. And as a result of divisions within the Russian ruling class, some in Russia wanted to do business with Germany, Germany was their enemy, and as a result of all kinds of different circumstances, this weird spin-off of Marxism called Bolshevism took power in Russia in 1970. Okay? And again, you know, how did it happen? There's so many what-ifs that you can do, right? Like, if this hadn't happened, that hadn't happened. It's almost a weird historical accident. Well, it's based on the fact that Lenin was obsessed, right? Lenin was obsessed with making a revolution. Thought about nothing but making a revolution 24 hours a day, right? What are you to do? The guy who talks, writes, thinks, and reads nothing but revolution 24 hours a day. And he was obsessed with, you know, figuring out how, you know, to do it. And, you know, they made the best of the crisis. And as a result of a number of weird circumstances, so what happened next? The Bolsheviks took power, and they created the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, they announced they were forming a new international, the Third International. Right? The Third International, right? Marx had the First International, the Second International. Now they were forming the Third International. And after Lenin died, the Third International declared its ideology to Marxism-Leninism. And Marxism-Leninism is a little bit different than what you call Bolshevism. Bolshevism was this movement in Russia. You know, the Lenin party of new type, theory of imperialism, and so on. But the Soviet government came into existence, and the Soviet government, its ideology that it promoted all over the world, that the Communist International promoted, was called Marxism-Leninism. Right? And it was teachings of Karl Marx, teachings of Lenin, as practiced by the Soviet government. Right? So it's a little bit different. And so let's talk about Marxism-Leninism. Right? So they formed the Communist International. To join the Communist International, you have to agree with 21 points. You must agree with. And after Lenin dies, there is a fight against Trotsky, and there's a fight against Bukharin. So after Lenin dies, the question is, what should the Soviet Union do? What should they do? Trotsky comes forward, and he had the theory of permanent revolution, that they should basically turn the Soviet Union into a base area to spread communism to the Western countries, because that's where it is, right? The Soviet Union was too poor to have socialism. The peasantry is a reactionary class. Peasants can't make a revolution. So basically, Trotsky wanted to create a militarized economy, and he wanted the Soviet Union to basically become a base for exporting communism to the Western countries. Well, the population of Russia was very weary of war. They didn't want that. And they didn't want that. They didn't want to march communism in Europe. They wanted their living standards to go up, and the Russian Civil War was horrendous. Millions of people died. There was a barricade. People were starving and desperate. They couldn't get medicine. And the idea of we're just going to have war until the end. And what Trotsky was proposing, his theory of the permanent revolution. After Trotsky, there was a guy named Bukharin. And Bukharin said, we're too poor. And so basically what we need to do is we need to bring foreign investment. And we need to have capitalism. We need foreign countries to just start investing here, and we'll tax them and we'll regulate them. Eventually, our economy will be big enough, then we can have socialism. And Trotsky was the left opposition, and he was defeated. And Bukharin was the right, and he wanted the Soviet Union to basically become a base for exporting communism to Western. Well, the population of Russia was very weary of war. They didn't want that. They didn't want that. They didn't want to march communism into Europe. They wanted their living standards to go up, and the Russian Civil War was horrendous. Millions of people died. There was a barricade. People were starving and desperate. They couldn't get medicine. And the idea, we're just going to have war until the end, it wasn't going to fly. What Trotsky was proposing, his theory of the permanent revolution, was rejected. After Trotsky, there was a guy named Bukharin. And Bukharin said, we're too poor. And so basically what we need to do is we need to bring foreign investment. And we need to have capitalism. We need foreign countries to just start investing here. And we'll tax them and we'll regulate them. Eventually our economy will get big enough, then we can have socialism. And Trotsky was the left opposition, and he was defeated. And Bukharin was the right opposition, and he was also defeated. And what came into power was Stalin. And Stalin had what's called socialism in one country. And socialism in one country became what Marxism-Leninism became synonymous with. A new economic and political system came into the world, starting in 1928, pioneered up into the 1930s. After World War II, it spread all over the world. It's a new political system that had never existed before. It was largely Stalin who invented it. He drew heavily from Lenin's theories, etc., but Stalin was the guy running the government. And he developed a very, very effective model for running a country. And this model is called, it was a communist government, Marxist-Leninist government. And basically the way it is there's one party, the Communist Party, that runs the country, and there's a very charismatic leader of the Communist Party. And then the Communist Party mobilizes 5-year economic plans, where they mobilize the country to go out and build. People get rewarded for working really, really hard. And people go out and they build and they construct, and the leader of the country, Stalin, or later Fidel Castro or Kim Il-sung, goes around rewarding people for working really, really hard. If you work really hard, you get a cash bonus, you get a reward, you get a medal. And there's one party, and they have a 5-year economic plan. This model was called, it was a communist government, Marxist-Leninist government. And basically the way it is there's one party, the Communist Party, that runs the country, and there's a very charismatic leader of the Communist Party. And then the Communist Party mobilizes 5-year economic plans, where they mobilize the country to go out and build. People get rewarded for working really, really hard. And people go out and they build and they construct, and the leader of the country, Stalin, or later Fidel Castro or Kim Il-sung, goes around rewarding people for working really, really hard. If you work really hard, you get a cash bonus, you get a reward, you get a medal. And there's one party, and they have a 5-year economic plan. And this model, what you call really existing socialism, is very good at industrializing countries. If a country's never had running water and electricity, if a country's never had paved roads, if it's never had universal literacy, this system is very good at getting it. And the Soviet Union, during the 1930s, they had 5-year economic plans that were very successful. And millions of people got modern housing, got electricity, got running water, got literacy because of the Soviet Union, because of Stalin. The 5-year economic plans were brilliant. And no country had ever rapidly industrialized the way the Soviet Union did. I will show this clip. It's one of my favorite clips. It's from a PBS documentary, because this clip shows, people who lived through it describing what it was like. And this is a side of the story we never hear in America, right? They always tell us, everyone was poor and starving. They tell you every horror story. Well, this is the other side of the story. This is why Stalin is still wildly popular in Russia. This is why, millions of people joined the communist parties of the world. When the rest of the planet was having a Great Depression during the 1930s, the Soviet Union rapidly became an industrial power.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded. And the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Ella Shishtir was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it.
Она давала мне...
The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
Она давала мне право трудиться, учиться так, как я хочу.
Yodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible, at one of the most difficult times, to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
Where is the objective?
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people.
Oh, by the way, the man himself says based stream. Thank you, the man himself. Thank you.
We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Akipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве дома был один эскаватор. И дом плохой.
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't...
Comrade Stalin says, "We are here. We are hard." That's right.
It was reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand. The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5.
I'm building socialism in one country.
Out of the trench, then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
Yeah, and I discovered this. People around the world know this, but in the United States, you would never know this. I remember, when I was a student, when I was a young person, my family we hosted an exchange student, a university student from Bulgaria, and he was very anti-communist. But I remember I asked him. I said, "Is there anyone in Bulgaria who still believes in communism?" And he said, "Oh yeah, my grandfather." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he talked about how his grandfather had fought in World War II. And after World War
Of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
5 or 6 levels. That
Is there anyone in Bulgaria who still believes in communism? In the United States, you would never know this. I remember
one takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5.
Oh, by the way, Code of Truth, I'm supposed to get info from Mole. Where do I find him? I'm at the Agroprom Research Institute, or what it used to be before Chernobyl. But yeah, I can't find the objective. Statistics ranking. Oh wow, I'm at 632. Code of Truth says, he's there. Have you rescued him? I heard somebody screaming, help me, brother, help me. Can someone help me? And then I shot all of the guys. I hit a gas tank and it blew up most of the soldiers, and then I shot the rest of them earlier in the stream. And I haven't heard that ever since.
5 or 6 levels.
He's on the top floor of one of the buildings. Okay, I'll go then.
That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
Yeah, and I mean, I discovered this. I mean, people around. I remember, when I was a student, when I was a young person, my family, in the United States, you would never know this. I remember, when I was a student, when I was a young person, my family, we hosted an exchange student, a university student from Bulgaria, and he was very anti-communist. But I remember I asked him, I said, is there anyone in Bulgaria who still believes in communism? And he said, oh yeah, my grandfather. And I said, what do you mean? And he talked about how his grandfather had fought in World War II. And after World War II, all the young men of Bulgaria were put to work building the roads of Bulgaria, because Bulgaria had never had paved roads before. And so all the young people of the country went out and paved the roads of the country. And it was one of the best things he could ever remember, was when he was a young man going from town to town in the country, paving the roads of the country. And it was a moment of national pride. They were all working together to build up the roads. And his grandfather, it was like the best years of his life, paving the roads of the country. And until communism came to Bulgaria, they didn't have paved roads. And
Comrade Stalin says, the green on the map is where he is. Okay, I'm heading there right now.
The country. And it was communism that built it. And it was communism that electrified many countries. And this system of what you call really existing socialism, Stalinism, whatever you want to call it, is very, very effective at raising people out of poverty. And they lie about this endlessly in U.S. media. You would never know this, right? And that's what infuriates me, is they make it sound like, it never worked anywhere. Everyone was just poor and starving. I learned at a very young age that's not actually true. The Soviet Union had huge economic successes and huge economic growth. So has China. So have many countries with communist governments. They have raised a lot of people up. They have wiped out illiteracy. And the problems that they have are in addition to huge economic successes. And nobody ever talks about that. And that's why right-wing anti-communism annoys me, because they just deny reality. You can say something, and that doesn't make it true. And and whatever criticisms you want to make, without with centrally planned economies, this Marxist-Leninist political system has had very effective economic results. After the Third International was created, as the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing with the 5-year plan, they had the Great Depression in the Western countries. And the governments that were, the parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, they had, from 1928 to 1935, they had what was called the Third Period, where they focused on opposing social democracy, right? Exposing social democracy as the enemy within, right? They argued that social democrats were trying to hold off the revolution. And so, they called social democrats social fascists, and they tried to build what they called the United Front from below, and they organized unemployed workers to demand jobs and education and relief, and millions of people were unemployed. Democrats were trying to hold off the revolution, and the Third International was created as the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing with the 5-year plans.
Where is he at?
Great Depression in the Western countries, and the governments that were the parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, they had from 1928 to 1935, they had what was called the Third Period, where they focused on opposing social democracy, right? Exposing social democracy as the enemy within, right? They argued that social democrats were trying to hold off the revolution, and so they called social democrats social fascists, and they tried to build what they called the United Front from below, and they organized unemployed workers to demand jobs and education and relief, and millions of people were unemployed in America and Britain and Germany. They had huge hunger marches demanding benefits in America.
Have you been to the sewer yet? No, I haven't. Code of Truth, I have not been to the sewer yet.
They had the famous bonus army where thousands of veterans occupied the National Mall, demanding that they be paid veterans benefits, and Social Security. All these things that we enjoy largely come from what the communists did during the Third Period. They built these mass movements of desperately poor people, demanding that they get food, demanding that they get fed, veterans, others.
Mole is supposed to bring you there.
Right? However, as a result of the Great Depression and the economic crisis and the threat of communist revolution, Germany, 1933, Hitler took power in Germany. And Italy already had a fascist dictatorship. And a lot of the governments of the Western countries, there was America and Britain and Germany, they had huge hunger marches demanding benefits. In America, they had the famous bonus army where thousands of veterans occupied the National Mall, demanding that they be paid veterans benefits, and Social Security. All these things that we enjoy largely come from what the communists did during the Third Period. They built these mass movements of desperately poor people, demanding that they get food, demanding that they get fed, veterans, others, right? However, as a result of the Great Depression and the economic crisis and the threat of communist revolution, Germany, 1933, Hitler took power in Germany. And Italy already had a fascist dictatorship. And a lot of the governments of the Western countries, there was a big faction within the government that openly wanted to set up a fascist dictatorship to prevent communist revolution. And ultimately, the fascists wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. Now, many people don't know this. When Italy and Germany and Japan, when they signed an alliance, what was it called? What was the actual name of the alliance? Now, you'll never hear this. What was the name of the alliance between the fascist countries? What did they call themselves? They called themselves, this is the Wikipedia page about it, even Wikipedia has to admit this, they called themselves the Anti-Comintern Pact. Right? Well, Caleb, communism and fascism are the same thing. The Anti-Comintern Pact was the name of the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan were the
Okay, Code of Truth says, you sure he is not dead? Yeah, I think he died. Sometimes he dies, it is okay. You can go into the sewer anyway.
They called themselves, this is the Wikipedia page about it, even Wikipedia has to admit this, they called themselves the Anti-Comintern Pact. Right? Well, Caleb, communism and fascism are the same thing. The Anti-Comintern Pact was the name of the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan were the Anti-Comintern Pact. Doesn't get more obvious than that, right? And so the Anti-Comintern Pact was from the fascist countries. And so in the Western countries, the communists switched their tactic very dramatically. And instead, they started forming what they called the Popular Front. And the Popular Front was the strategy that basically they argued capitalism, the Western system, was was naturally moving toward fascism. But most people don't want a fascist dictatorship. They want democracy. They want freedom. And so communists would position themselves as the leader of the struggle against fascism. And that would lead to them having a revolution. And that was actually a very effective strategy. In many countries, when Nazis invaded, the communists they started forming what they called the Popular Front. And the Popular Front was the strategy that basically they argued capitalism, the Western system, was naturally moving toward fascism. But most people don't want a fascist dictatorship. They want democracy. They want freedom. And so communists would position themselves as the leader of the struggle against fascism. And that would lead to them having a revolution. And that was actually a very effective strategy. And in many countries, when Nazis invaded, the communists led the resistance to them, and they became the leaders, right? Yugoslavia was invaded by the Nazis, and the Yugoslavian people fought the Nazis, and the people leading them were the communists, and afterwards, the communists ran Yugoslavia. Albania was invaded by the Nazis, and after, it was invaded, the people of Albania started fighting back, and the people leading the resistance were the Albanians. So they took power, right? There's a great book about it. I recommend, actually, the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, Enver Hoxha, right? You can read all about how they basically, the fascists invaded, and they turned that into a way to take power. And across Eastern Europe, right? The Soviet Red Army would liberate a country, and then they would put the various anti-fascist parties in power. But the Soviet Union would start funding them, and building their power plants, etc., and they become part of the Warsaw Pact. Eventually, the communists would be in power. Right? And that strategy called the Popular Front was a really dramatic shift in communist strategy. And we will get back to this later, but I want to show you, this was Madison Square Garden in 1939. This is Madison Square Garden. I've shown this picture many, many times, but it's very, very important, right? One of the first the first public invaded by the Nazis, and the Yugoslavian people fought the Nazis, and the people leading them were the communists, and afterwards, the communists ran Yugoslavia. Albania was invaded by the Nazis, and after, it was invaded, the people of Albania started fighting back, and the people leading the resistance were the Albanians. So they took power, right? There's a great book about it. I recommend, actually, the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, Enver Hoxha, right? You can read all about how they basically, the fascists invaded, and they turned that into a way to take power. And across Eastern Europe, right? The Soviet Red Army would liberate a country, and then they would put the various anti-fascist parties in power, but the Soviet Union would start funding them.
Okay, Code of Troops says, you're in the right place. Look for his body. Those military fascists got him. Oh, darn. A fellow comrade has fallen. A fellow comrade has been martyred for the cause.
Building their power plants, etc., and they become part of the Warsaw Pact, and eventually the communists would be in power, right? And that strategy, called the Popular Front, was a really dramatic shift in communist strategy. And we will get back to this later, but I want to show you, this was Madison Square Garden in 1939. This is Madison Square Garden. I've shown this picture many, many times, but it's very, very important, right? One of the first CPI, the first public CPI event we ever had. We actually made our own version of this. We made our own Lincoln head at the front of the room, right? That was Madison Square Garden in 1939. And, what does it say there? At the top it says security, democracy, friendship between the people of the USA and the USSR, right? And the communists completely changed their messaging stuff. They became ultra-patriotic, right? They loved Abraham Lincoln. They were the defenders of American democracy, and fascism was un-American because America was a democratic country. And they would say that if George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln were alive today, they would be members of the Communist Party. And they were fighting for democracy, and they were fighting against fascism, and they were fighting for the working class. And during World War II, the communists became a really, really essential part of the fight fight against the Nazis. Henry Wallace, who was the vice president of the United States, openly praised Stalin and said Stalin was great, and talked about how eventually they wanted to create some kind of socialist system after the fall of the Soviet Union. They wanted to create after the defeat of the Nazis. They wanted to create a century for the common man. Roosevelt even proposed an economic bill of rights. Right, before he died during World War II, Roosevelt, in his last State of the Union address before he died, Roosevelt came forward and he said that everyone should have the right to a job and the right to housing and the right to education. I will show. This is Roosevelt proposing, the President of the United States proposing that we should have an economic bill of rights, that our
I found his body.
For freedom is good, but we also need...
Okay, I found his body. Experienced, loner, neutral. This is the mark. This is Mole. Okay, I found him. Code of Truth. Find the stash. Hold on a second, I'll have to drop these items. There's a helicopter coming. Find the stash. Oh no. Let me get back over to guns. Yeah, you should save. Code of Truth says you should save, yes. The Century of the Common Man. Something that Ghost of Niccolo does not believe in. What a shame. We will build factories, we will build railroads. We will build great things. Code of Truth says you're right near the sewer entrance. There's a helicopter over there. Find the stash. Oh, that must be it. Looks like the passage has been blocked. Let me go ahead and save, comrade.
Economic rights, in addition to civil rights, civil liberties, we need an economic bill of rights. And that, there were Hollywood movies honoring Stalin and honoring the Soviet people, and how eventually they wanted to create some kind of socialist system after the fall of the Soviet Union. They wanted to create after the defeat of the Nazis. They wanted to create a century for the common man. Roosevelt even proposed an economic bill of rights. Before he died during World War II, Roosevelt, in his last State of the Union address before he died, Roosevelt came forward and he said that everyone should have the right to a job, and the right to housing, and the right to education. I will show. This is Roosevelt proposing, the President of the United States proposing that we should have an economic bill of rights, that our bill of rights, freedom is good, but we also need economic rights in addition to civil rights, civil liberties. We need an economic bill of rights, and that, there were Hollywood movies honoring Stalin and honoring the Soviet people, and this was all very, very important. This is FDR's Economic Bill of Rights speech. Right? This is the President of the United States. This is Michael Moore saying this, right? This is some liberal saying this. This is FDR.
In our day, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. The Second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his product at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom. Freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies and author of wrong. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care. The opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment.
Yeah, that's the President of the United States basically saying everyone should have the right to a job, everyone should have the right to health care. And, I mean, this, every old person should have a pension. That's big, right? And it was because they were aligned with the Soviet Union. And the point is that the communists didn't sound like communists anymore, right? And that communism from Karl Marx's time was very much tainted with the aesthetic of rebellion and the aesthetic of anger and rebellion. There's two very good books I recommend. Marx and Freud, A Dialectical Study, by Ruben Osborne, and his follow-up book, The Psychology of Reaction. And in those books, he basically says that the communist movement, he wrote these books in 1939, right? Same year that this happened, when the communist movement was dramatically changing its messaging style. And he says that the communist movement has a big problem because it appeals to people's unhealthy emotions, right? It appeals to people's libidinal and animal feelings, right? Libido is your rage and sex drive, right? Anger, violence, and sex are linked to each other, right? And your libido is, everyone has anger within them, and everyone has a sex drive. And your edible feelings is the feeling of every teenager wants to murder their parents. It's just a normal thing. Teenagers really get mad at their parents. They really, part of growing up is you need to get out on your own. You need to not be under your parents. So every teenager basically has the desire to kill the parent of the same sex. It's the edible. Communism as a movement, coming out of the French Revolution, was largely a movement that appealed to people's libidinal and edible desires, right? You want to cut off the head of the king, he's a tyrant, he's an oppressor, and you want to let your anger out in society. You want to have free sex, and you want to get your rage out at injustice. You want a big explosion of anger, a big explosion of free sex, and you want to cut the king's head off, and you want to take down the tyrant, and all of that. And communism as a movement was appealing to people's libidinal and edible complex. Well, actually, all those feelings are part of natural human emotion. They're not, if someone is deeply libidinal or deeply edible, they're not going to have a healthy way of being. And what Ruben Osborne argues in his book is that fascism at the time, was appealing to people's healthier emotions, people's love of country, their love of their homeland, their love of their community, people's desire, in a lot of cases, for parental transference, right? That fascism, appealing to the fatherland, why they call it the fatherland, the love of your parent. And that fascism was appealing to people's desire to belong, to be part of the community, etc. And that fascism was leading people to do very, very evil things, but it was appealing to much healthier emotions. And that what Ruben Osborne argued, and what the communist movement clearly did during the Roosevelt years and during the Popular Front, was that they were trying to change their appeal and not appeal to people's libidinal and ethical feelings, but rather to their more healthy emotions, their desire for community, their desire, their love of their parents, their love of their country, their homeland, and that communism, in order to win, basically, it started looking like this. Instead of the red flag and the guillotine and all that, it was friendship between the USA and the USSR, loving Abraham Lincoln, loving your country. That's much healthier emotions, and that was appealing to people's healthier emotions, people's love of country, their love of their homeland, their love of their community, people's desire, in a lot of cases, for parental transference, right? That fascism, appealing to the right? Fascism is appealing to people's desire to belong, community, etc. And fascism was making people do very evil things, but it was appealing to much healthier emotions. And then what Reuben Osborne argued, and what the Communist Movement clearly did during the Roosevelt years and during the Popular Front, was that they were trying to change their appeal and not appeal to people's libidinal and ethical feelings, but rather to their more healthy emotions, their desire for community, their desire, their love of their parents, their love of their country, their homeland, and that communism, in order to win, basically, it started looking like this. Instead of the red flag and the guillotine, and it was friendship with the USA and the USSR, loving Abraham Lincoln. That's much healthier emotions. And that's what Reuben Osborne argues. The aesthetics, the spiritual vibe of communism changed. I often talk about Superman, right? The Superman comic books. No one would ever think that they were communist. And how could that be comic books at the time they came out? Superman, he was the man of steel. What did Superman say? Man of steel in Russian. Stalin. Right? And Superman, rescuing, striking workers, went around fighting the Ku Klux Klan, Nazi racism. Superman was very much in line with the Popular Front. Maybe he wasn't a Communist Party member, but he liked the Soviet Union, hated racism, loved labor unions. He was for truth, justice, and the American way. And, the Communist Movement largely changed its appeal to not be about rage and vengeance and killing the king and unleashing your sexual desires, and instead to be about feelings of community, feelings of brotherhood, etc., so that fascists couldn't, use those feelings for evil. Right? Very interesting. But anyway, that's Marxism-Leninism. And so after World War II, right, Marxism-Leninism massively spread over the world, and it was a large section of what was run by Marxism-Leninism. But even before World War II, right, let's keep this in mind. So as the Popular Front was happening, as the global communist movement was moving into its patriotic, its patriotic mode, right? What was happening in the Soviet Union? There was a horrendous event in the Soviet Union called the Great Terror, right? 1937. It was awful, and it was basically a mass panic in the country about Nazi spies. Right? They feared that Nazi spies were infiltrating the country, and they were. There were Nazi spies. And, there was a Soviet official who was assassinated. People got angry, and people started turning on their neighbors. People would be held in suspicion if they said something that someone thought was not communist. Who shouldn't have been. And everyone Yezhov, right? The guy named Yezhov was running the secret police, and eventually Stalin gave Yezhov the death penalty because it got so out of control. But even according to some of Stalin's biggest admirers and supporters, it's very clear that thousands and thousands of innocent people got hurt. There was an atmosphere of panic. People were turning in their neighbors. If you said something, if you made a joke, or you said something to be held in suspicion, and that basically they created an atmosphere where people were telling on each other. Cancel culture, except much more vicious kill, where people were telling on each other, where people were turning each other in, you got points for turning somebody else in. It was a really, really ugly atmosphere. And it was a very horrendous period, the Great Terror. And the fear was very justified. There were plenty of international saboteurs and Nazi spies and so on. But at the same time, you know, the population was kind of whipped up into this bit of like vengeance. And after World War II, you know, China and the Soviet Union had their fall. And in China, after China and the Soviet Union had their fall, China wanted to improve its own. They had a similar, a little bit different. Along similar cultural revolution. When in China, they mobilized the young teenagers as red coats to go out and try and colonization. China purely they destroyed a lot of the classical temples and ancient ruins and monuments in China because it was ancient communist way of doing it. So they, you know, they went after women who wore makeup because they said that was bourgeois decadence. And you know, at one point they went to where all the foreign diplomats lived and they executed their pets because they said owning pets was mimicking slavery or something. And, you know, it was really awful, right? And the Cultural Revolution was this attempt to make China purely communist by appealing to people's edible and libidinal feelings, right? And it was students who were going after their teachers, and kids were turning in their parents, and it was revenge, and, you know, it is right to rebel was the slogan, and the Cultural Revolution in China was pretty horrible. It was pretty awful. In 1976, they ended the Cultural Revolution. They arrested Jiang Qing, the leader of Mao's wife. They blamed her for those were two events, the Great Terror in 1937 and the Cultural Revolution, that really kind of showed that spiritual aesthetic that communism had been appealing to, the edible, libidinal drive, right? That drive doesn't go to healthy places, and if it's unleashed, it can really lead people to hurt each other. Now, after the Second World War, you know, communist countries exist, all kinds of different communist countries, and many countries industrialized, wipe out illiteracy, pave the roads, build huge power plants, etc. But after that, they developed a bit of a problem, which is that, you know, once you have paved the roads and laid the foundations of modern industrialization, then if everybody is a government employee and everyone is getting paid by the government, and, you know, a kind of atmosphere sets in where you don't have innovation and creativity. Because new ideas, once you have paved the roads and laid the foundations, etc. But after that, they developed a bit of a problem, which is that, you know, once you have paved the roads and laid the foundations of industrialization, then everybody and everyone is getting paid by the government. And, you know, kind of atmosphere sets in where you don't have innovation. Because new ideas right? And, you know, anyone who's ever worked in bureaucratic organizations knows what this is like. That, you know, if you have a really good idea, right? Some bureaucrat, you know, right? And the Soviet Union was really good at making this. It was really good at building power plants, really good at its space program, really good at weapons, AK-47, but it was not good at clothing. Right? Clothing, they could never keep up with the West because, you know, people, you know, how do you know what clothes to make? Well, that's based on who buys it. Clothes with their dollars, people purchase. Children's toys, they could never keep up with it. Consumer goods, the things that make life fun. Soviet Union really couldn't keep up with it. And the Western countries very much boycotted, barricaded, and, you know, consumer all the fun stuff. The West was a fun place for consumer goods, and the communist countries, there was no unemployment, no one had health care, they lifted up from third world conditions, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that you have in the West, right? They had a lot more economic security, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that you have in the West. And that became an issue. Furthermore, there was a layer of people in the Soviet Union that were very high-achieving people that were completely stifled, right? And you see this, right? In many communist countries, you go there, there's somebody who is really smart, right? And really high-achieving, but it doesn't get them anything. You know, you go to Cuba, even now, right? You'll see there's many bitter people in Cuba that are doctors, but because of the social system, they don't have room for them in the medical system, right? You know, you need a taxi driver who's got a medical degree, he could be a doctor, but the Cuban medical system doesn't have room for him, right? And so he's stuck driving a taxi. And, you know, you meet people like that. That's the kind of bitterness, right? People that are college professors, filmmakers, writers, engineers, people that are, you know, high-achieving individuals that kind of feel trapped. And that's what the Berlin Wall was about, right? That communism had been appealing to, the Oedipal and the Vidno drive, right? That drive doesn't go to healthy places. And if it's unleashed, it can really lead people to really hurt each other. Now, consumer goods, the things that make life fun, space program, really good at weapons, AK-47, but it was not good at clothing. Right? Clothing, they could never keep up with the West because, you know, people, you know, how do you know what clothes to make? Well, basically, people buy it. Their dollars, people purchase. Children's toys, they could never keep up with it. Consumer goods, the things that make life fun. The Soviet Union really couldn't keep up with them. And the Western countries very much, you know, boycotted. The Soviet Union was barricaded, and, you know, consumer goods, blue jeans, Beatles records, you know, all the fun stuff. The West was this fun place full of consumer goods, and the communist countries were countries where there was no unemployment. You know, there was no one went without health care. There was universal literacy and all of that. They lifted up the conditions, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that we have in the West, right? They had a lot more economic security, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that we have in the West. And that became an issue. Furthermore, there was a layer of people in the Soviet Union that were very high-achieving people that were completely stifled. Right? In many communist countries, you go there, and there's somebody who is really smart, right, and really high-achieving, but it doesn't get them anything. You know, you go to Cuba, even now, right? You'll see there's many bitter people in Cuba that are doctors, but because of the socialist system, you know, they don't have room for them in the medical system, right? You know, you need a taxi driver who's got a medical degree, he could be a doctor, but the Cuban medical system doesn't have room for him, right? So he's stuck driving a taxi. And, you know, you meet people like that. That's the kind of bitterness, right? Where there's people that are college professors, people that are filmmakers, people that are writers, people that are engineers, people that are, you know, high-achieving individuals that kind of feel trapped. And that's what the Berlin Wall was about, right? Most people in East Germany didn't want to leave, but the people who were high-achieving did want to leave, right? And that the Berlin Wall was there to keep them in, right? It was there to, you know, basically say, no, we need engineers, we need scientists, we need doctors. So you're going to know, you can't just get out and leave. Your average factory worker did not want to leave, but, you know, your high-achieving person did want to leave and go to the West, but they could make it. And there were a lot of people in the Eastern Bloc who were very stifled, right? They were very trapped. And on top of that, these countries are barricaded, military district. They don't have the same type of freedom. You know, you can't be seen as being against the laws, right? Right? And they don't have the same level. And eventually, it was those high-achieving people, those artists, those filmmakers, the most privileged people in the country, often the children of the party of the people. They became in awe of the West, and they were convinced that the Western capitalist countries were amazing, the Western capitalist countries were awesome, and they went out in 1989, and they overthrew the government of Czechoslovakia, they overthrew the government of East Germany, and they overthrew the government of Romania, and eventually they overthrew the government of the Soviet Union. And these countries lost their socialist system. And again, they, you know, a lot of the people who went out and protested to bring down the Soviet Union didn't want free market capitalism. They wanted socialism, but to have the ability to shop at Walmart, the ability to drink Coca-Cola, the ability to, you know, wear blue jeans, right? And they wanted the ability to have more freedom when it came to making movies. But they didn't realize that in America, for a big studio to make a movie, you're going to get censored way more than any government bureaucracy in the USSR is going to censor, right? And as Soviet Union, there's political limitations. Say in America, if you work for a big studio, they're going to regulate everything because their money is on the line. That's a whole other story. But you know, the Soviet Union was overthrown, Eastern Europe was overthrown, and the economic results were disastrous. And that's one thing. Again, right? And, you know, again, all these people go on about communism is so bad. The fall of the Soviet Union was an economic disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union led to a rapid drop in living standards, a rapid drop in life expectancy, mass unemployment, mass unemployment, dying of people, life expectancy, much less than 10%. And again, this is a very nuanced conversation we're having, right? We're not saying communism is good. We're being honest about, you know, what's going on, but we're also not buying into the standard American bullshit, all right? There was Reed Naomi Klein, right? Reed Naomi Klein, the shock doctor, mass unemployment, mass hunger, the suicide rate. It was a disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union, the whole country was economically demolished, right? And they, you know, and the free market, you know, it devastated the place. So let's be honest about this. And again, you know, this is why, you know, for a long time, I was very much a dogmatic believer. I thought that the Stalinist way of doing things was the best way of doing things. We just adopted the Stalin thing because no one ever acknowledged the huge achievements of the Stalin era, and no one ever acknowledged the failures of capitalism when capitalism was restored in the USSR. The returning of capitalism to Eastern Europe was an absolute nightmare and disaster. By all economic measures, mass death, mass unemployment, mass hunger, and they never acknowledge that. All these people, you know, it's just the standard American thing. Oh, communism, you know, communism is just a big failure, and capitalism is the best. Well, then why didn't things get better when the Soviet Union fell? So, you know, you have this nuanced conversation, okay? We're acknowledging that the Soviet Union fell for a reason. That they stagnated, people felt trapped, it was intellectual, they did. It came to consumer goods, Coca-Cola, and clothing, blue jeans, you know, and they didn't have the freedom. There was a lot of problems that led to the fall of the USSR. But there's this, again, you know, you want to avoid black and white thinking, right? The world is much more complicated. And the black and white thinking, it's because of the black and white thinking that I was attracted to communism to begin with, because I could see through the lies I was being told. They said the Soviet Union never achieved anything. Communism has just never done anything good, anything. That's just not true. And the fall of the Soviet Union, bringing in free market capitalism in the 90s, was an absolute disaster, right? And they never acknowledged that either. There's this ignorance that every American thinks they know about that. They know that the Soviet Union was an utter hellhole, never achieved anything. That's not true. They also know that capitalism is this great system. That's not true either. It's complicated. So anyway, Soviet Union fell. China did not fall. China is still run by the Communist Party. Because in 1976, they started saying, what can we do to not have the Soviet Union? And they developed a new economic system, a new economic model of socialism Chinese capitalism, where the government controls the banks, the government has 5-year plans, but they allow private investment. In fact, the government helps set up corporations, and they find the engineers, the scientists, they give them funding to start their own businesses and start up enterprises. And it's a new economic system. The government, it's not free market. The economy is still run by the state and planned by the state, but they use the market and they don't stifle the innovation of the young people. They invest in it and they promote it, and the government has the responsibility to oversee economic and utilizing the market to build an overall strong economy, right? You know, big market sector, but a popular state comes out of anti-corporate charge. In China, they adjusted their system. In China today, right, they have 5-year economic plans, and they have built the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. They have the world's largest steel industry. They've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They have the world's largest hydroelectric power plants. They've paved roads in rural areas. What China has achieved with this model of a highly market-friendly social, a planned economy that facilitates economic growth and uses the market to raise people out of poverty. What China has done has been very, very, very successful. No country in the world has ever lifted as many people out of poverty as China. And this model that was kind of pioneered on the Deng Xiaoping theory, China's reform and opening up socially, China's was very successful. Now, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and in Latin America and Eastern Europe, they imposed insane free market policies, right? And in Latin America, it was an absolute disaster. In Ecuador, I was in Ecuador in 1999. The IMF forced them to sell off their state-run oil company, forced them to adopt the US dollar as their currency. It was a disaster. In Bolivia, they had to auction off their water, they privatized their water, and it was an absolute disaster. In Eastern Europe, you had mass sex trafficking, poverty. The 1990s was a very difficult time because of neoliberalism. In response to neoliberalism, you got a wave of opposition. And in Russia, it took the form of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said, look, the neoliberalism, the free market stuff has gotten out of control. And he took office. And he said, I'm going to take the oil and the natural gas and put them under state control. And he created two state-run energy companies, Gazprom and there's a huge market sector that very well developed, right? And it's a lot like China, right? Where China, again, they have the government, controls the economy, but there's a huge market, right? And that's what they have in Russia, right? It's very much inspired by Russia. And in Venezuela, you had the rise of Hugo Chavez, took control of the oil and used the oil money to stabilize the Venezuelan economy, to build up the Venezuelan economy, etc. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista has been very, very, very successful. They have imposed insane free market policies, right? And in Latin America, it was an absolute disaster. In Ecuador, I was in Ecuador in 1999. The IMF forced them to sell off their state-run oil company, forced them to adopt the US dollar as their currency. It was a disaster. In Bolivia, they had to auction off their water, they privatized their water, and it was an absolute disaster. In Eastern Europe, you got mass sex trafficking, poverty, and the 1990s was a very difficult time because of neoliberalism. In response to neoliberalism, you got a wave of opposition, and in Russia, it took the form of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said, look, the neoliberalism, free market stuff is getting out of control, and he took office, and he said, I'm going to take the oil and the natural gas and put them under state control, and he created two state-run energy companies, Gazprom and Rosneft, and put them in the center of the economy, and used government-controlled energy revenue, money from oil and gas, to rebuild the economy. And Russia's economy is very planned, but there's a huge market sector that is very wealthy people, right? And it's a lot like China, right? Where China, again, they have the government, controls the economy, but there's a huge market, right? And that's what they have in Russia, right? It's very much inspired by Russia. And in Venezuela, you had the rise of Hugo Chavez, took control of the oil, used the oil money to stabilize the Venezuelan economy, to build up the Venezuelan economy, etc. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas took power months ago. They implemented these kind of policies. And now all over the world, you have countries that have what you can call 21st century socialism, which is they have a government that comes out of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution. They control their natural resources, they control their banks and their lending money, they have state central planning, but they have a huge market sector. They have all kinds of private companies, they have all kinds of private enterprises, they start working with cooperatives, they subsidize people to start their own businesses, and the state plans the economy, but it uses the market as a mechanism for making the country wealthy. And that model, that's what most of the BRICS countries have. Now, not all of India is not like that, but the basis of the BRICS stuff, is 21st century socialism. They have China, but they have Russia, but they have Venezuela, but they have Iran, but they just, adopted, West Africa, the Union of Sahel states, Ibrahim Traore, and these are countries where the anti-colonial state plans the economy and investing in, right? And that model is very, very different. So that brings us to where we are today with innovation. The Center for Political Innovation. We have an understanding that incorporates all of this, and we're not classical Marxists on communists. But we haven't abandoned anti-imperialism. We haven't abandoned the struggle to raise people out of poverty and defeat imperialism. We haven't abandoned defense for countries that have broken out of imperialism. We fight for working families. What is innovation? What does innovation mean? Well, this is basically what we've got. These are the 5 things that we've got. Number 1, we celebrate human growth and creativity. There's something special about human beings. No other species is capable of human beings. No species is like human beings. We have the ability to innovate, to reinvent the world around us, and force the environment to serve us. And Marx knew that. Marx is innovation. Well, this is basically what we do. These are the 5 things. Number 1, we celebrate human growth and creativity. There's something special about human beings. No other species is capable of what human beings can do. Human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel, artificial intelligence, and iPhones in just 8,000 years. Bees are still making their bee hives the same way they were 8,000 years ago. Ants are still making their ant farms the same way they were 8,000 years ago. No species is like human beings. We have the ability to innovate, to reinvent the world around us, and force the environment to serve us. And Marx knew that. Marx talked about this. Frederick Engels talked about this, but they weren't the first ones. This is in the Bible, right? God says to man, go forth and take dominion over the earth, be fruitful, multiply. This is in ancient Greek mythology. They talk about Prometheus, right? Gave man the ability to make fire, gave man the ability to innovate, right? And there's something special about human beings. We are not just another animal. We have within us the spark of divinity, right? If you define God as the creator, what separates human beings from animals is that we have creativity, right? We have a godlike ability to be creative. And again, Marx knew this. If you read Frederick Engels' his essay about the role of labor and the transition from ape to man, and if you read Marxism, this is actually a foundational belief that Marxists have. They just kind of forgot about it, right? They just kind of don't emphasize it. But if you read Marx, right, the whole understanding of labor theory of value, all of this is in Marx, right? And this is an important part of Marxism. But it's deeper than that. It's a spiritual point. It's the basis, I think, of Christianity acknowledges it. Ancient Greeks recognized it. This is a metaphysical, spiritual point that human beings have creative ability. We are the innovative species. We're the tool-making species. We have a spark of creativity, and that defines our humanness. And that we are constantly reinventing our relationship with nature and advancing towards a higher mode of existence, increasing our life expectancy, increasing our population, making life more comfortable. No species has the ability to take dominion and be fruitful and multiply the way we do. And that is very, very special, right? And that's something to celebrate about humanity. So that's the first point. And again, that's not contrary to anything that Marx said, but it's not emphasized in Marx as much as we emphasize it too. We are opposed to imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. Some people globalism, and some people use imperialism. We've started using globalism / imperialism because if you just say imperialism, people think global, right? People think imperialism is about white privilege, or imperialism is this. Both people use the word imperialism, they don't know what it means, right? And it's just, you're so imperialistic. What do you mean? They don't know what it means. And we're referring to an economic system. People on the right talk about globalism, and a lot of them are talking about this system. But then Illuminati, Satanists, the blood of the goat, sacrifice children. We're not doing that. So when we say globalism slash imperialism, or imperialism slash globalism, it's clear we're talking about an economic system.
Okay, so Code of Truth, that's what I was talking to you a few months ago about these rightist conspiracy theories that you fall prey to. Code of Truth. You're basically, the Freemasons will spread a lot of satanic Illuminati stuff to diverge you away from the actual truth. And that's what I meant when I told you about Bill Cooper and the way that Bill Cooper was, and the limitations of Bill Cooper's worldview. The limitations of the Weltanschauung of Bill Cooper. It's completely limited. Code of Truth. If you were to sit down and talk about the history of the ancient orders and the ancient mystics, obviously, he would give you some answers, perhaps even a good amount of information. But if you were to sit down in a room with Bill Cooper, Code of Truth, and talk about ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, higher dimensions, higher mathematics, psychoanalysis, psychopathy, mentalism, etc., Bill Cooper would know absolutely nothing about it, because he was a middle American redneck evangelical Christian who believed in a young earth. Okay? After a certain point, his Weltanschauung was flawed. Okay? If you were to put Sigmund Freud and Bill Cooper in the same room, Code of Truth, who do you think would win Code of Truth? It would be Sigmund Freud. That's right, Code of Truth. Sigmund Freud would win the debate, and Bill Cooper would lose the debate. Why is that, Code of Truth? Can you explain that to me in the chat? I'll give you a few minutes to think about it.
Big banks and monopolies dominating the world. And we oppose that system. And the main push of that system right now is Malthusianism, degrowth. That's what the World Economic Forum is pushing. That's what the big banks and monopolies are pushing. They're pushing degrowth. They want to reduce the human population. They say there's too many people in the world. And it's not really about the environment. It's about the fact that they can only stay at the top of the hill if human growth ends. Right? Imagine the game King of the Mountain. Right? You know, one kid's at the top and he says, game over because I'm at the top. That's what they're doing. And so Malthusianism, depopulating the planet, degrowth,
I think I might have found it.
all of that is what imperialism, globalism, imperialism is resorting to in order to hold on to power. Right? And that's why they beat down countries. These wars that they wage are to beat down countries, right? These countries like Libya was the most prosperous country in Africa, but the imperialists beat down Libya, destroyed Libya, and now it's in ruin. People are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out. It doesn't have electrification. Libya's been destroyed by imperialism, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union, they degrew the Soviet Union, closed down the factories, mass unemployment, and then Putin came to power and rebuilt it. Right, and that imperialism is about degrowth, right? And Malthusianism is the economic theory that says growth is bad, and we're opposed to that. And we understand that globalism, imperialism is becoming desperately Malthusian in order to stay in power. That's something we understand. And that, again, Marx spent a lot of his writing opposing Malthusianism, and Lenin, a Marxist, but again a deviant Marxist, he developed the theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So, is that contrary? I don't know, but it's we're focusing on opposing globalism, imperialism, and Malthusianism. Point number 3. We call for a pro-growth, pro-humanity state. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And I think that that's basically basically what all the countries around the world that have broken out of imperialism. They have.
All right. Well, as I expected, there is not an answer from Comrade Stalin or from about the Bill Cooper and the Sigmund Freud debate. So, Bill Cooper, if he were to talk about how the Illuminati sacrifice a goat and put its blood on a satanic altar, or they sacrifice the blood of a virgin child, that would look absolutely silly in the eyes of most people. And it doesn't matter how blue-pilled or how mind-controlled they are, regardless of how controlled the masses are, saying something like that is still not a very credible argument. It is not a very good point of a logical deduction to say that globalism is bad because the Illuminati and secret societies cut out the blood of the billy goat and sacrifice it to Satan. It's not a very credible way of making a good argument. And so that is how Bill Cooper would lose to Sigmund Freud. Because Sigmund Freud would say that that is a symptom of Bill Cooper's childhood sexual repression. He would say that that is a product of Bill Cooper's repressed sexual nature. Repressed sexual nature and ultimate sexual desire. And therefore, he would go to, he would find a relief of this repressed sexual nature by making these conspiracy arguments. And obviously, Sigmund Freud's going to win. That's the truth, Comrade Stalin. You have to acknowledge these facts some point in your life, okay? You're not going to be 23 for the rest of your life, Code of Truth. You're not going to be 23 for the rest of your life thinking about all these conspiracy theories. Okay, one day you're going to wake up and you're going to be 50 years old and you would have wasted 25 years of your entire life on that. You will be 50 years old and you will be stuck in a point in your life that you could have spent moving forward and growing, but instead you remained stunted and you stayed in the same place. That is the problem with Ghost of Niccolo, okay? I will tell you this. I could try to give Ghost of Niccolo positive advice and feedback, but he's not going to listen to me. Because he is 35, 36, and one day, Ghost of Niccolo is going to be 75 years old. He will never be married again. All of his children left him. His wife left him. He will have a minimum wage job or no job at all, and he'll be homeless. He'll be in a crazy-ass religious cult, and he will be confused and mixed up. His psyche shattered. His psyche will be shattered. And he will be binge drinking alcohol. And he will die. And he would have had no achievements. Nobody's going to go to Ghost of Niccolo's funeral. Because he creeped people out. Now, Code of Truth. Is that what you want to become? Is that the type of person that you want to be? Do you want to end up like Mormon Shaggy, taking a bunch of drugs and live streaming, almost overdosing on unelicited drugs? Probably dying of a sexual disease from a prostitute. Or do you want to make something of yourself? Is there something about this life that we live, this life, that has a higher purpose than those things? Could there be something beyond the physical bounds and limitations of what our senses allow us to see? Could there be something that is metaphysical, inherently almost divine about humans? Semi-divine, Promethean-like. So, that's all I'm going to say. That's all that I needed to say for the time being. It's too late for Mormon Shaggy, and it's almost too late for Ghost of Cletus. It's too late for Ghost of Cletus, but it's not too late for you, Code of Truth. It's still not too late. So, something that you should think about. Look at the stars in the sky. Look at all the stars in the heavens, in the sky. Think about all the galaxies in the universe and all the stars in the various galaxies. Think about the higher purpose of what man's mission is. Ghost of Cletus doesn't even believe in space. That's how deranged of a belief system that Ghost of Cletus has. He can't even believe that the Earth is round, even though science says it is. His psyche is so broken, and his subconscious is so flawed and so bipolar and contrarian that he can't even see the light in front of his hand. Ghost of Niccolo can't even see or describe what's in front of his eyes. Much less can he determine that the world is round. Much less that he can determine that it goes around the sun. Is that something that you really want for your future? Anybody's future.
They have anti-monopoly governments. They have governments that are pro-growth, pro-humanity, invest in people, and come out of an anti-imperialist revolution and build up a planned economies, 5-year economic plans to build up their people. That's what we need here. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we need in America. There you go. And in order to fight for that, we want to build an anti-monopoly coalition. And those words, anti-monopoly coalition, that's the Communist Party in the 1950s. There was a time, maybe a decade or so after this, the Communist Party was for that. Right? And that was the one to build a coalition against the imperialist.
Trying to find the sewer.
That's what we want to do. But there are divisions within the working class, and we seek to utilize those divisions to build an anti-monopoly coalition. Again, is that communist or not? I don't know. And then the final thing is that we have a psychoanalytical and spiritual approach. We reject...
All right, I made it into the sewer. Eliminate the bandits by the Agroprom Research Institute.
Act the libidinal and edible politics. Right? We understand that the aesthetics that leftism gives to the desire to burn it down, tear it down, punish people, rage and vengeance, free sex, edible, kill your parent, that isn't going to build a healthy world. And it was weaponizing those deviations, that deviant way of thinking, that led to the strength of the Soviet Union, Bolshevism, down and manipulated further. By the way, woke politics is libidinal edible politics. We want to build a constructive politics. Love of community, love of family, love of society. We're not trying to...
Yes, I found it.
Love, kindness, loyalty, etc. So...
Alright, let's see here. Code of Truth says, you found it. Sudhanshu says, bro is playing the OG game. There you go.
Well, those 5 points are what defines us. And we are basically continuing the struggle against globalism and imperialism. we're, learning what went on in the 20th century. We understand why China adjusted to the way it is. We understand why the left have lost their mind. And with innovationism, we have a new understanding that gives us the ability to build a completely new movement. So, you ask, are we just rebranding communism? We have something of our own. This isn't just communism. Put communism in the toilet, and we just, all just a bunch of Trumpers now? No, we're not, right? We are anti-imperialist, anti-globalist, fighting for working families.
Who's that?
Government, pro-growth, pro-humanity state.
Whoops.
We celebrate human growth and creativity. We are aware of things, but we're doing it on the foundation of studying and understanding what happened in the 20th century, where Marxism came from, where Marxism went. We're doing something new.
I need a body shield.
It's a set of principles that we develop upon which we can build a successful organization. So I hope that this slideshow helps clear things. You can understand what we're doing.
Got him.
But yeah, this is what we're doing. We're building the innovationist. We stand with all the countries.
You're too heavily loaded.
We stand for working families. We celebrate human creativity. We are opposed to globalism and imperialism. And we want to build an anti-monopoly coalition and eventually create a government of action that will fight for working families.
All right. I think this is a good place to stop.
Let's fast forward back into not the present where Sykes and Pico
And
are drawing with their crayon on a handkerchief.
I don't claim to know everything, but I think a man who wants to ask women for feet pics and stuff is not where I want to go. It's not where I want to be in life. Anyways, next time we'll hit the sewers. I am your host, Imperator of Forge, and I will see you next time. Peace.